There's someone in your life right now who's slowly stealing pieces of your soul, and you probably invite them to do it. You might even call them friend, family, or mentor. Jung discovered that certain people don't just take your energy, they fundamentally alter your psychological structure, leaving you questioning your own reality, your worth, and your deepest truths. What's most disturbing is that these soul-draining encounters often happen with people who appear helpful, loving, or spiritually evolved. They operate in shadows, using psychological mechanisms so subtle that you blame yourself for feeling empty after every interaction with them. If this speaks to something inside you, hit subscribe. This channel explores truths others are afraid to say. Carl Jung spent decades mapping the human psyche, and one of his most profound discoveries was how certain personality patterns, what he called psychological complexes and shadow projections, create energetic vampirism between people. These aren't just difficult personalities or temporary conflicts. These are deep archetypal patterns that literally feed on your life force, your authenticity, and your psychological wholeness. Jung understood that we don't just exchange words or favors with people. We exchange psychic energy. Some people naturally generate and share this energy, while others have learned to extract it from those around them. The most dangerous soul drainers aren't obviously toxic. They're often the ones who present themselves as healers, teachers, or devoted friends. They've mastered the art of appearing indispensable while slowly consuming your sense of self. Today, we're going to explore 6 specific types of people who drain your soul through psychological mechanisms that Jung identified. More importantly, we'll discover how to recognize these patterns, protect your energy, and reclaim the parts of yourself that have been scattered or stolen. This isn't about judgment, it's about awareness. Because once you see these patterns clearly, you can never unsee them, and that recognition becomes your first step towards psychological freedom. What I'm about to share might make you uncomfortable. You might recognize yourself in some of these patterns, or you might suddenly understand why certain relationships leave you feeling hollow. Stay with me through that discomfort. It's where your liberation begins. Chapter 1. The psychological parasite, the covert narcissist. Jung wrote extensively about the shadow, the parts of ourselves we refuse to acknowledge, but he also identified something far more insidious. People who have completely severed their connection to their own shadow and instead live by consuming the psychological energy of others. The covert narcissist is perhaps the most dangerous soul drainer because they masquerade as the victim, the helper, or the misunderstood genius. Unlike the obvious narcissist who demands attention through grandiosity, the covert narcissist drains your soul through a more sophisticated psychological manipulation. They present themselves as wounded, special, or uniquely burdened by life's injustices. They've learned that vulnerability can be weaponized, that playing the victim grants them access to your empathy, your energy, and ultimately, your life force. Here's how they operate. They share their struggles in ways that make you feel chosen, special for being trusted with their pain. But notice what happens after these intimate conversations. You leave feeling drained, confused, or somehow responsible for their well-being. They've transferred their emotional burden to you while positioning themselves as the sensitive, deep one who others just don't understand. The covert narcissist has perfected what Jung called projective identification. They unconsciously project their own shame, inadequacy, and rage onto you, then react to you as if you embody these qualities. You start questioning your own perceptions, your own emotional reactions, your own reality. This is psychological warfare disguised as intimacy. In your professional life, they're the colleague who constantly seeks your advice, but never implements it, who shares their workplace struggles until you're emotionally invested in their success, then subtly undermines your own achievements. In personal relationships, they're the friend who monopolizes conversations with their crises, who remembers every slight against them, but forgets your celebrations, who somehow makes your good news feel inappropriate or insensitive. The most devastating aspect of the covert narcissist is that they've convinced themselves, and almost convince you, that they're the injured party. They've built their entire identity around their wounds, their specialness, their misunderstood nature. They don't just drain your energy, they make you complicit in your own depletion by making you believe that your exhaustion is evidence of your compassion. Jung understood that healing requires taking responsibility for our own psychological wholeness. The covert narcissist has abdicated this responsibility entirely, instead creating an elaborate system where others must carry their emotional weight. They don't want to heal, they want to be special in their suffering, and they need your energy to maintain that specialness. If you've ever left a conversation feeling like you've been psychologically emptied while the other person seems mysteriously renewed, you've encountered this pattern. The recognition itself is your first act of reclaiming your power. Chapter 2. The Spiritual Hijacker, the False Guru. Jung was fascinated by what he called inflation, the psychological state where someone identifies so completely with an archetype that they lose touch with their human limitations. The false guru represents one of the most spiritually dangerous forms of soul draining because they hijack your deepest longing for meaning and transcendence. The false guru doesn't necessarily wear robes or claim divine authority. They're often found in corporate leadership, wellness communities, or even within your own family structure. What distinguishes them is their unconscious belief that they've transcended ordinary human struggles and now exist to guide others toward enlightenment. They've convinced themselves that their insights are revelations, their opinions are universal truths, and their emotional reactions are spiritual responses. Here's the psychological trap they create. They position themselves as the bridge between you and your own spiritual awakening. They subtly suggest that your direct relationship with truth, with God, with your own inner wisdom, must be mediated through them. They don't steal your energy through obvious manipulation. They steal it by making you dependent on their interpretation of your own spiritual experiences. The false guru operates through what Jung called the savior complex. They need you to be lost so they can be found. They need you to be confused so they can be clear. They need you to be seeking so they can be the answer. Your growth becomes their identity, your dependence becomes their power, and your spiritual hunger becomes their psychological food. In therapy settings, they're the counselor who never seems to help you reach resolution, who keeps you perpetually processing the same issues, who subtly suggests that healing requires their ongoing guidance. In spiritual communities, they're the teacher who discourages questions, who interprets your doubts as resistance, who makes you feel guilty for trusting your own inner knowing. The most insidious aspect of the false guru is how they corrupt your relationship with your own spiritual discernment. They teach you to doubt your inner voice while elevating their own interpretations as sacred truth. They create what Jung called psychological possession, a state where you become so identified with their vision of your spiritual path that you lose touch with your own authentic spiritual nature. But here's what Jung discovered. True spiritual authority never demands surrender of your own discernment. Authentic teachers point you toward your own inner wisdom, not toward dependence on their interpretation of it. They empower your direct relationship with truth rather than positioning themselves as indispensable intermediaries. The false guru fears your spiritual independence because it threatens their inflated sense of purpose. They've built their entire identity around being needed, being special, being the one who understands what others cannot. Your awakening, your direct knowing, your spiritual autonomy represents the death of their psychological inflation. If you've ever felt spiritually diminished after receiving spiritual guidance, if you've ever felt more confused about your path after seeking clarity, If you've ever felt guilty for questioning someone's spiritual authority, you've encountered the false guru pattern. Your spiritual discernment is not rebellion, it's your birthright. Chapter 3. The Emotional Hostage Taker, the Perpetual Victim. Jung understood that victimhood, while sometimes a genuine response to trauma, can also become a psychological prison that traps not just the victim, but everyone in their emotional orbit. The perpetual victim has learned to weaponize their pain, turning their wounds into chains that bind others to their emotional drama. The perpetual victim operates through what Jung called the wounded child complex. Except instead of healing this wounded aspect of themselves, they've learned to use it as a tool for controlling others. They've discovered that their pain grants them power, that their suffering makes them special, and that their wounds excuse them from the hard work of psychological growth. Here's how they drain your soul. They make you responsible for their emotional state, while simultaneously ensuring that nothing you do ever truly helps. They share their struggles not to process or heal, but to recruit you into their emotional drama. They need witnesses to their pain, supporters for their battles, and most crucially, they need you to feel guilty whenever you're not available to tend to their wounds. The perpetual victim has perfected the art of emotional manipulation disguised as vulnerability. They share their trauma stories in ways that make you feel specially chosen, uniquely capable of understanding their pain. But notice what happens when you try to offer solutions, when you suggest healing resources, when you encourage them to take responsibility for their recovery. They resist, they deflect, they find reasons why your suggestions won't work for their special circumstances. In family systems, they're the relative who monopolizes every gathering with their latest crisis, who makes every celebration about their struggles, who ensures that their emotional needs always take precedence over collective joy. In friendships, they're the person who calls only when they're in crisis, who remembers every way they've been wronged but forgets your support, who makes you feel selfish for having your own problems. The most soul-draining aspect of the perpetual victim is how they corrupt your natural compassion. They teach you that love means suffering alongside them, that loyalty means staying trapped in their emotional prison, that friendship means sacrificing your own well-being for their bottomless needs. They turn your empathy into a weapon against your own psychological health. Jung recognized that true healing requires what he called the heroic journey, the willingness to face our wounds, integrate our shadows, and take responsibility for our own psychological wholeness. The perpetual victim has rejected this journey entirely. They've chosen to remain frozen in their trauma, using their pain as both shield and sword. But here's the deeper truth Jung discovered. Enabling someone's victimhood isn't compassion, it's a form of psychological violence. When you allow someone to use their wounds to control your emotional state, you're not helping them heal. You're helping them stay sick. You're not being loving. You're being complicit in their psychological stagnation. The perpetual victim fears your boundaries because boundaries threaten their control. They fear your emotional independence because it challenges their belief that others should sacrifice their well-being for their comfort. They fear your refusal to carry their pain because it forces them to confront the possibility of carrying it themselves. If you've ever felt emotionally drained after trying to help someone who never seems to get better, if you've ever felt guilty for being happy when someone else is suffering, if you've ever felt trapped by someone else's emotional needs, you've encountered the perpetual victim pattern. Your emotional freedom is not abandonment, it's survival. Chapter 4. The Identity Thief. The psychological mimic Jung wrote extensively about the persona, the mask we wear to navigate social situations, but he also identified a more disturbing phenomenon. People who have no stable sense of self and instead survive by absorbing and mimicking the identities of others. The psychological mimic doesn't just drain your energy, they steal pieces of your very identity. The psychological mimic operates through what Jung called unconscious identification. They lack a cohesive sense of self, so they unconsciously absorb the personality traits, interests, values, and even the mannerisms of people they encounter. This isn't conscious mimicry, it's a psychological survival mechanism developed by someone who never learned to exist as a separate, autonomous individual. Here's how they drain your soul. They make you feel incredibly seen and understood in the beginning, mirroring back your own interests and values with uncanny accuracy. They seem to get you in ways that others don't. They share your passions, your worldview, your spiritual insights. But slowly, you begin to notice that they don't just share your interests, they've absorbed them entirely, often claiming them as their own original discoveries. The psychological mimic has what Jung called a porous ego boundary. They can't distinguish between their own thoughts and feelings and those of others. When they're with you, they become a version of you. When they're with someone else, they become a version of that person. They have no stable core identity. They exist as a psychological chameleon, constantly shifting to match their environment. In professional settings, they're the colleague who adopts your innovative ideas and presents them as their own, who mirrors your leadership style until it becomes unclear who influenced whom, who somehow manages to receive credit for insights that originated with you. In personal relationships, they're the friend who starts dressing like you, talking like you, even dating people similar to your romantic interests. The most unsettling aspect of the psychological mimic is how they make you question your own originality. After spending time with them, you might find yourself wondering if your thoughts, your style, your very personality are truly your own, or if you've somehow absorbed them from somewhere else. They create what Jung called psychological confusion, a state where the boundaries between self and other become blurred. But here's what's most soul-draining about this pattern. The psychological mimic doesn't just steal your identity, they dilute it. They take your unique qualities and reproduce them in ways that lack depth, authenticity, or genuine understanding. They turn your sacred insights into superficial talking points, your hard-won wisdom into borrowed phrases, your authentic self-expression into performative gestures. Jung understood that authentic identity formation requires what he called individuation, the process of becoming who you truly are, separate from the expectations and projections of others. The psychological mimic has never undergone this process. They exist in a state of permanent psychological adolescence, never having developed the courage to discover and express their own authentic nature. The psychological mimic fears your authenticity because it highlights their own emptiness. They fear your originality because they have no original thoughts of their own. They fear your self-possession because they've never learned to possess themselves. They need to absorb your identity because they've never developed their own. What makes this pattern particularly dangerous is that the psychological mimic often appears to be your biggest fan, your most devoted follower, your most understanding friend. They shower you with admiration and attention, making you feel special and seen. But gradually, you realize that their admiration is really a form of psychological consumption. They're not celebrating your uniqueness, they're harvesting it. If you've ever felt like someone was wearing your personality like a costume, if you've ever felt uncomfortable with how closely someone was copying your style or ideas, if you've ever felt like your unique qualities were being diluted by someone's imitation, you've encountered the psychological mimic. Your authenticity is not a template for others to copy. It's a sacred expression of your individual soul. Chapter 5. The Emotional Terrorist, the Rage Addict. Jung identified anger as one of the most primitive and powerful emotions in the human psyche. But he also discovered that some people become addicted to rage, using it as both a drug and a weapon. The rage addict doesn't just have anger issues. They've learned to use their explosive emotions to control, manipulate, and dominate others. They drain your soul by keeping you in a constant state of emotional terror. The rage addict operates through what Jung called emotional terrorism. They've discovered that their anger has tremendous power over others. It can silence opposition, end uncomfortable conversations, and force people to accommodate their needs. Their rage isn't just an emotional response, it's a psychological tool they've learned to wield with devastating effectiveness. Here's how they drain your soul. They create an atmosphere of emotional unpredictability where you never know what might trigger their explosive anger. You find yourself constantly monitoring their mood, adjusting your behavior to avoid their wrath, and walking on eggshells to maintain peace. Your entire emotional landscape becomes organized around preventing their next outburst. The rage addict has what Jung called emotional dysregulation. But unlike someone who struggles with anger and seeks help, the rage addict has learned to use their emotional volatility as a form of control. They've discovered that their anger can make people apologize for things they didn't do, agree to things they don't want, and sacrifice their own needs to appease the rage addict's emotional demands. In family dynamics, they're the parent who explodes at minor infractions, making children feel responsible for managing their emotional state. They're the partner who uses anger to win arguments, to avoid accountability, to shut down conversations they don't want to have. In professional settings, they're the boss who creates a climate of fear, the teammate who holds meetings hostage with their emotional outbursts. The most soul-draining aspect of the rage addict is how they corrupt your relationship with your own emotions. They teach you that anger is dangerous, that conflict is catastrophic, that peace requires your constant vigilance and sacrifice. They turn your natural desire for harmony into a prison of emotional suppression. But here's what Jung discovered about the rage addict. Their anger isn't really about the situations that trigger it. Their rage is about power, control, and their own deep-seated feelings of powerlessness. They've learned that anger can make them feel temporarily powerful, temporarily in control, temporarily significant. Their rage is actually a defense against their own feelings of insignificance and helplessness. The rage addict fears your emotional independence because it threatens their control. They fear your boundaries because boundaries limit their ability to use anger as a weapon. They fear your refusal to be terrorized because it forces them to confront their own emotional immaturity. Jung understood that healthy anger is a temporary response to injustice or boundary violations. But the rage addict has turned anger into a lifestyle, an identity, a way of being in the world. They've become addicted to the rush of power that comes with explosive anger, and they need others to be afraid of them to maintain that feeling of control. The rage addict doesn't want to heal their anger. They want to keep using it. They don't want emotional regulation. They want emotional domination. They don't want relationships. They want hostages. If you've ever felt like you were walking on eggshells around someone, if you've ever found yourself apologizing for things you didn't do to keep peace, if you've ever felt terrorized by someone's emotional volatility, you've encountered the rage addict pattern. Your emotional safety is not negotiable. It's a basic human right. Chapter 6. The Psychological Vampire. The chronic complainer. Jung understood that some people have learned to survive by feeding off the emotional energy of others, and perhaps no pattern is more quietly devastating than the chronic complainer. Unlike the rage addict who drains you through fear, or the covert narcissist who drains you through manipulation, the chronic complainer drains your soul through relentless negativity that masquerades as sharing or bonding. The chronic complainer operates through what Jung called negative emotional contagion. They've learned that sharing their dissatisfaction, their frustrations, their endless list of grievances creates a kind of emotional intimacy with others. They mistake complaint for connection, negativity for depth, and shared misery for meaningful relationship. Here's how they drain your soul. They approach every conversation as an opportunity to download their latest dissatisfactions. They remember every slight, every inconvenience, every disappointment, and they need to share these experiences in exhaustive detail. They turn casual conversations into emotional dumping sessions, social gatherings into complaint festivals, and friendly check-ins into opportunities to catalogue everything wrong with their lives. The chronic complainer has what Jung called a negativity bias on steroids. While healthy people naturally notice problems in order to solve them, the chronic complainer notices problems in order to complain about them. They've become addicted to the temporary relief that comes from expressing their dissatisfaction, but they're not interested in actually addressing the sources of their complaints. In workplace settings, they're the colleague who can find something wrong with every policy, every decision, every change. They create an atmosphere of cynicism and dissatisfaction that spreads like a psychological virus. In social situations, they're the friend who can't enjoy a beautiful day because they're focused on the traffic getting there, who can't appreciate a good meal because the service was slow, who can't celebrate others' successes because they're too busy cataloguing their own failures. The most soul-draining aspect of the chronic complainer is how they corrupt your natural optimism and resilience. They teach you that positivity is naive, that gratitude is superficial, that hope is foolish. They turn your attempts at encouragement into evidence of your failure to understand their special burden of awareness about how terrible everything really is. But here's what Jung discovered about the chronic complainer. Their endless complaints aren't really about the external circumstances they describe. Their complaining is a defense against taking responsibility for their own happiness, their own choices, their own emotional state. They've learned that being a victim of circumstances feels safer than being responsible for changing them. The chronic complainer fears your contentment because it challenges their worldview that suffering is inevitable and complaining is justified. They fear your solutions because solutions threaten their identity as someone who understands how difficult everything really is. They fear your boundaries around their negativity because they've learned to use complaints as a way of demanding attention and emotional labor from others. Jung understood that healthy people process difficulties in order to move through them. They complain temporarily as a way of seeking support or venting frustration, but they don't build their entire identity around their dissatisfaction. The chronic complainer has turned complaint into a way of being, negativity into a lifestyle, and dissatisfaction into a form of psychological addiction. The chronic complainer doesn't want their problems solved. They want their problems witnessed. They don't want their circumstances to change. They want their suffering to be validated. They don't want to feel better. They want others to feel worse so they won't feel so alone in their misery. What makes this pattern particularly insidious is that the chronic complainer often frames their negativity as realism, their complaints as honesty, their pessimism as wisdom. They make you feel like your optimism is naive, your gratitude is superficial, your hope is a form of denial. They turn their psychological dysfunction into a superior form of awareness. If you've ever felt emotionally drained after listening to someone's complaints, if you've ever felt like your positive energy was being systematically depleted by someone's negativity, if you've ever felt guilty for being happy when someone else is perpetually dissatisfied, you've encountered the chronic complainer pattern. Your joy is not insensitive, it's necessary for your psychological survival. Conclusion. Reclaiming your soul's sovereignty. Now that we've explored these 6 soul-draining patterns, you might be feeling overwhelmed, recognizing people in your life who fit these descriptions, or perhaps uncomfortably recognizing aspects of these patterns in yourself. This recognition, difficult as it may be, is what Jung called the beginning of consciousness, the first step towards psychological freedom. Jung understood that we cannot heal what we cannot see, and we cannot protect what we don't value. By learning to recognize these soul-draining patterns, you're not just protecting your energy, you're reclaiming your right to psychological wholeness, emotional sovereignty, and spiritual authenticity. But here's where most people make a critical mistake. They try to change the soul drainers, to heal them, to make them see how their behavior affects others. Jung discovered that this approach not only fails, it actually strengthens the very patterns you're trying to heal. Why? Because these patterns exist precisely because they work. They've learned to extract energy, attention, and emotional labor from others, and your attempts to heal them actually feed the very dysfunction you're trying to address. The path to freedom isn't through changing them, it's through changing your relationship to them. Jung called this withdrawing your projections, stopping the unconscious process by which you give your power away to others. This means recognizing that their emotional state is not your responsibility, their healing is not your mission, and their approval is not necessary for your well-being. Pause here and ask yourself, where in your life have you been trying to heal someone who doesn't want to be healed? Where have you been sacrificing your own energy to feed someone else's dysfunction? Where have you been accepting treatment that you would never accept for someone you love? The process of reclaiming your soul's sovereignty requires what Jung called individuation, the courage to become who you truly are, separate from the needs, expectations, and demands of others. This doesn't mean becoming selfish or uncaring. It means becoming so full of your own authentic energy that you can give from abundance rather than depletion. Jung discovered that healthy relationships are characterized by what he called mutual individuation, two whole people choosing to share their completeness rather than two incomplete people trying to use each other to fill their emptiness. The soul drainers we've discussed today operate from emptiness, seeking to fill their psychological voids through others, rather than doing the inner work necessary to heal themselves. Your energy, your attention, your emotional labor, these are not unlimited resources to be distributed to anyone who demands them. They are sacred gifts to be shared consciously, with people who honor them, reciprocate them, and support your own psychological growth. Jung understood that the most spiritual thing you can do is protect your own wholeness so you can give from a place of fullness rather than scarcity. This doesn't mean abandoning people who are struggling. It means learning to distinguish between people who are struggling and seeking help and people who are struggling and seeking enablers. It means recognizing the difference between supporting someone's healing journey and becoming complicit in their psychological dysfunction. The soul drainers in your life may respond to your new boundaries with anger, manipulation, guilt-tripping, or emotional blackmail. Jung predicted this. He understood that when you stop feeding someone's dysfunction, they will initially escalate their demands before they're forced to find other sources of supply or begin their own healing journey. Your job is not to manage their reaction to your boundaries. Your job is to maintain your boundaries despite their reactions. Your psychological health is not a negotiable commodity. Your emotional well-being is not a sacrifice you owe to others. Your soul's sovereignty is not a luxury, it's a necessity. Jung spent his life studying the human psyche, and one of his most profound insights was that we teach people how to treat us by what we tolerate. Every time you allow someone to drain your energy without consequence, you're training them to continue that behavior. Every time you sacrifice your well-being for someone else's comfort, you're teaching them that your needs are less important than theirs. But here's the most liberating truth Jung discovered. When you stop giving your energy to those who drain it, you suddenly have abundant energy for those who deserve it. When you stop trying to heal those who don't want to be healed, you have tremendous capacity to support those who are genuinely seeking growth. When you stop accepting soul-draining relationships, you create space for soul-nourishing connections. The people who truly love you will celebrate your boundaries, not violate them. The people who genuinely care about you will support your well-being, not threaten it. The people who deserve your energy will honor it, not exploit it. If this resonated with you, leave a comment below. Share which of these patterns you recognized, how this awareness is already shifting something within you, or what boundaries you're ready to establish. Your transformation might be exactly what someone else needs to hear to begin their own journey toward psychological freedom. Share this with someone who needs to hear it, someone who's been giving their soul away piece by piece, someone who's been accepting treatment they don't deserve, someone who's ready to reclaim their energy and their life. Subscribe to walk deeper with us into the mind, soul, and mystery. Your consciousness is your greatest gift to yourself and to the world. Protect it fiercely, nurture it tenderly, and share it wisely.